There is something universal to the experience of finding community. It is invigorating. When you find community, you want to spend time there. You want to give it energy. When I was 19 years old, I was a transfer student at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque when a new friend of mine invited me to come check out the women's rugby team, the Atomic Sisters. I didn't know anything about rugby except that it was a contact sport. I imagined it to be something like football. And up until that day, I didn't know that there were women's rugby teams. I responded to my friend's invitation with enthusiasm, and I was out on the pitch for the next practice with a cheap pair of soccer cleats and a mouth guard. I was introduced to the team, an eclectic group of women, some tall, some short, some stocky, some skinny. Some were young college kids like me, others were nearing their 30 or older. We ran for a bit and then started drills, and within the first 30 minutes of practice, I found myself at the bottom of a pile of bodies, clutching to the oblong ball while being crushed by a significant amount of weight above me. From where I lay, I could hear some concern being expressed by the women at the top of the pile, saying something like, "Hey, get up. The new girl is down there. We don't want to hurt her on her first day." And I laid there as people slowly peeled away. And when the last person stood and my teammates looked down at me, they saw a beaming face as I exclaimed, "I love this game." I grew up with 3 brothers, and being physical with people was a part of how I expressed connection. The first boy I had a crush on confessed to me years later that he was quite scared of me in 4th grade, as my flirting seemed much more like an attempt at sparring in his memory. I remember my 2 best friends sitting me down in 9th or 10th grade for an intervention of sorts, gently communicating to me that they loved me very much, but my tendency to wrestle and punch was literally hurting them. Toning it down was a challenge that I grappled with through high school. So finding rugby was like finding the answer to a puzzle that had been plaguing me. I didn't know it at the time, but I was joining a community that day with whom I would always feel a connection. I played for more than 6 years as an Atomic Sister. I schlepped gear. I served as team captain. I coached. I filled out annual forms for university funding. I hosted parties and attended rugby union meetings. My first child was something of a team mascot when he was a baby. To this day, when I meet another woman rugger, I feel an instant kinship. Rugby players are people from all walks of life, but we share a love for this quirky, crazy, high contact game, and we share a familiarity of the unique culture of that sport, born from the community that loves it. As I was discovering rugby, I was also studying linguistics and sign language interpreting. Studying American Sign Language introduced me to another community that was thriving in Albuquerque, the deaf community. Deaf folks in the city would gather once a week at this amazing restaurant across from the UNM campus called The Frontier. ASL interpreters and students were graciously welcomed to join these gatherings, which was such a gift as it offered us an opportunity to practice our language skills and to experience and learn about deaf culture. Deaf folks are an eclectic bunch of people too, young and old, tall and short. Some are born deaf, others lost their hearing suddenly or over time in childhood or as adults. Each person in those social gatherings was uniquely themselves and at the same time part of a community with a vibrant culture. I was not a member of that community so much as a guest. I was there to learn, and they welcomed me so they could teach me to serve their community better. If you've ever spent time in the deaf community, in deaf community spaces, you know that they have different cultural rules. Sharing time with them meant not being fluent with the rules in the room. Far beyond my awkward emergent language skills, I was awkward and emergent in my understanding of their culture, and the learnings those gatherings offered was rich. There's a documentary on Netflix that came out this spring titled Crip Camp. It documents how in the mid-60s through most of the 1970s, a summer camp in the Catskills called Camp Jened cultivated a community for teens with disabilities. Those teens who met at camp would go on to lead the fight for Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and some of them continued on as activists for decades to follow, eventually serving as key players in the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. The story is engrossing. There's a significant amount of actual footage from the camp where these young people found community and where a shared disability culture grew. As a viewer, you get to watch it happen. You can feel how important it was that these people found each other and were given the freedom to speak their truths. You watch as teenagers open up around camp tables and verbalize their need for privacy, their need for intimacy, for autonomy, and for freedom. You hear them express frustration at the barriers in the outside world that stand between them and the lives they wish to live. You can see the bonds forming as older campers model radical self-love to those younger folks. And then as the movie moves on to their eventual activism in the intense fight for disability rights, you can see how the strength of that summer camp community carried each of its members forward, their connection and commitment to one another critical to the incredible progress that they made fighting for disability rights as adults. There is footage in the film of a 25-day sit-in that was held at the Federal Building in San Francisco, which was instrumental in getting Section 504 passed. And the same faces of young people from Camp Jened pop up again and again in the footage. The leaders of the movement called their friends from camp. They called on their community and asked them to come. And of course, their community came. I found myself wondering just how many other stories there are where community building is the beginning of long-term change. It was obvious watching that film that we would not have the ADA if Camp Jened hadn't become a radicalized summer camp for disabled teens. What are the seeds? What are the sparks that help us to move toward building the beloved community? We sometimes make a mistake of looking for instant magic when we join a community, and it doesn't always work like that. Sometimes you are exclaiming your love for the group in the first 30 minutes, but probably more often you just catch a glimpse of something that might meet a need, and it's enough for you to decide to give your time to the possibility. Sometimes you look back 15 years and realize for the first time how formative a group of people have been in your life. The spark can be small or blazingly bright. But when we feel seen, when we can be one part of who we are wholly, those moments hold amazing potential. And maybe even more importantly, when we recognize that we're not all the same, we do not all need the same things, and our individual identities are always in relationship with the communities around us, that might open us up to a whole new set of possibilities. Community is not one thing, nor does one community serve the entirety of any one person's identity. Yet, if any of us stopped to examine the various communities with whom we have been connected over the arc of our lifetime, I suspect we'd find ourselves with an intriguing inventory of what makes us tick, of who we are and what matters to us. And perhaps we would also begin to recognize that the deep value of individualism in the dominant culture around us is discordant with the reality of what motivates and inspires us as human beings. Most of the people listening to me today know I've been a UU since I was young, and community is a word that pops up a lot in UU conversations. We are a non-creedal religious community, an eclectic bunch of folks, tall and short, young and old. Some of us are theists, others are atheists, agnostics, pagans, and so on. Many UUs struggle with how to describe what connects us all when we embrace so many different theologies and bring so many different experiences into our church. The word community can cover a lot of ground in answering that question, but when you think about that a little more, it might be something lost if we describe UUs as a community. Last year at UU General Assembly, Reverend Paula Cole-Jones presented the FOS lecture, where she described a framework for our faith she called a community of communities. Her lecture resonated with me at the time, but this year, in a workshop revisiting her ideas, something really clicked for me. I don't think she said anything remarkably different, but I finally felt her vision for myself, I think. Reverend Jones begins explaining the framework as an alternative to describing our congregations as a family, which I've also heard many times before, and I know I've used that description myself, our South Church family. She says we rarely question the idea of being a family because it's sacred. Family is a sacred idea. But, she says, for UUs, the metaphor of family no longer holds our values and our collective identities, or the complexity of how we relate in the world around us. If we are a family, then the idea is that we all belong to one thing. And I'd say we all belong to multiple things, she says, not to one thing. The community of communities is a structure that reflects that. For us as individuals, the multiple communities hold our interests and the aspects of our identities. A community of communities. Within our church, there is the spiritual book group and the knitting ministry. There is Aging with Grace and the social justice associates who reach out to many people in our larger community. There is Seacoast Family Promise, who also connect with so many people beyond the walls of our church. We have a religious education community within our church, South Church Folk Group and the choir, and Voices from the Heart, who many of whom are not South Church members, and yet build a beautiful community with so many who are. Within our church, there is. I could go on and on. There are so many communities, many of whom we already recognize and resource. And there is potential for many communities within and beyond the walls of our church that have not yet been named or with whom we have not yet fully connected ourselves. All of that feels really promising to me. What would be different if we honored our differences in the same way that we celebrate what we share with one another? If our collective work was built around our collective mission, but the discernment of what that mission calls us to do was in large part the work of the various communities with whom we identify. Imagine how a model like that could transform the walls that exist between various communities and could also transform the walls that separate us, South Church or Unitarian Universalists, from the larger world. It accomplishes three really important things. It acknowledges that each of us needs to feel seen. It reminds us that we are not a community of individual needs, but rather we are a community of communities' needs. And it allows us, for each of those communities, to deepen into shared identity, to grow and to take action. Often, says Paula Cole-Jones, movements are a community of communities that have come together to work in solidarity, to support each other, and change an injustice. In the movie Crip Camp, there was a beautiful documentation of that kind of interconnectedness. The disability rights movement recognized the importance of showing up at all kinds of civil rights protests. Jim Lebrecht, one of the movie's producers and a former camper from Camp Jened, explained, "You have to make it a two-way street of engaging with social justice movements. We showed up for the other movements back in the day, and folks came and showed up for us." Because of this solidarity, during the sit-in in San Francisco, Black Panthers showed up with food and supplies to help the protesters make it through. A community of communities, living wholly into who they are and holding on to how they connect to others. I want to say that again. A community of communities living wholly into who they are and holding on to how they connect to others. Any movement, says Jim Lebrecht, any community needs to take a look at who's not at the table. They can learn this lesson that it is their diversity and their breadth of knowledge within their community and their breadth of experience that makes them better and stronger. I don't know what it's like to be you, he says. So when you tell me what your experience is like, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to see you. And I'm going to believe you. May it be so.